My name is Susan Kim, and I am a member of the board of the Sawtooth Intpretive and Historical Association. Today is December 3rd, 2025, and we are here with John Rember to discuss his time in the Sawtooth Valley. John, first let me say thank you so much for your time today. This interview will allow you to reflect on and share your experiences and memories of your time in the Sawtooth Valley. Through these questions, I hope to gain insight into how life has changed over the decades as more and more people come to Stanley to recreate. Before we begin, can I have you state and spell your name?
John Rember, Johnrember.
Where and when were you born?
I was born on October 22nd, 1950, and I was born on the third floor of the Sun Valley Lodge, which was at that point a hospital left over from the time Sun Valley had been a naval hospital during World War II.
Very interesting. And how did your family come to settle in Stanley, and what kept them there despite the harsh conditions?
My father had been a hard rock miner at the Triumph Mine, which is halfway between Haley and Ketchum in Idaho. And he had a tough life, as hard rock miners do. And I think that he had packed a couple of bodies of his coworkers out of the mine, and he decided he had to get out from underground. And I also found one of his paychecks or pay slips in a little building that he had moved to this place a long time after we had moved there. But I think it was in the late 40s, and he had made $44 for a 40-hour week. So we were living in company housing, and there wasn't a company store, but it was a similar system. The wages were pretty poor, and it was kind of a dead end way to live. And he figured he'd go to Sawtooth Valley and try to be a salmon fishing guide. He loved to fish, and he came over here because he had he needed a place to meet clients. He ended up buying these 40 acres, and that's why I'm here today.
How did he build clientele when he was new to the area? Do you have any recollection of that?
Word of mouth, mostly. He had a huge number of repeat customers every summer.
And as far as buying the 40 acres with the wages that he had made, do you know how he made that happen?
My mother was a registered nurse, and she did a lot of special duty nursing. And I think between the two of them, they'd both gone through the Depression as teenagers, and they compulsively saved their money. And they of their own. And so these 40 acres were to a guy named Harry Pierce. And he was the guy who made a lot of the lodgepole furniture that is still around the valley. And a lot of the lodger that is around the valley was copied from Harry Pierce's designs. A sawmill and a workshop with all sorts of lathes and wood carving tools. And he had gotten into his 60s and had lung disease from the sawdust, and he was having to sell. And there was another family, the Cutlers, in the valley, who had a small sawmill, and they were negotiating to buy this place. And Harry Pierce had put a $4,000 price on these 40 acres. And when it came time for them to do the deal, they said, "We can't afford the 4,000. We'll give you 3,000." And my father had been talking to Harry Pierce, and he called Dad up and said, "It's yours if you come up with 4,000." And Dad said, "We've got a deal." It didn't make us too popular with the Cutlers, but that was the way the valley worked in that time. Is there were a lot of people sort of working on a subsistence level, and I suppose my parents were there too, although they were subsisting on tourist dollars, which was in 1953 when we bought the place, kind of a new aspect of the economy. There had been a few people like the Guth brothers who were running sort of a proto float trip business. And I don't know much about that, but I know they were kind of in the business and trying to establish that sort of concept in people's minds. But there was very, very little going on here outside of summer tourist season. And so basically anybody who wanted to make it here usually had to, we were sort of like the cattle. We had to leave in the winter or we'd starve to death. So that's how we ended up here. And my father was a trapper at the same during the spring and the falls of those summers when he was a guide. And he made pretty good money trapping at that time. It's impossible to make money trapping now, so it's more or less a cruel hobby. But he had some pretty good paychecks after trapping beaver and mink, marten, coyotes, otter, and he put food on the table, and he did such a good job. And my mother, of course, was in there with him every step of the way. We wouldn't have made it without her. But he did such a good job that I grew up not feeling poor. Although if you looked at the dollar amounts, I think we'd qualify.
So you mentioned the difference in the money that is available for trapping now versus then. What made that difference in the ability to make a living trapping?
You could, well, this was a time, I think, in the 50s, $5,000 income was middle class. And he would get paychecks both spring and fall. As I remember, he'd get $1,200 in the spring and maybe $1,000 in the fall. And that was substantial money in those days. And then as he built his guiding business, he was charging $10 a day per fisherman. And he would guarantee them a fish on the line, but not a fish on the bank, because it took a lot of skill to get a Chinook salmon out of that fast-flowing water and up on the bank. So a lot of those guys got the thrill of having a big fish on the line, and then the despair and tragedy and wreckage of losing it. So, but he kept getting more and more people um, involved, and I remember these clients were extremely grateful, and we would every year we would get Christmas presents from all his clients. So that was kind of exciting. It gave me a view of humanity was maybe a little more benign than it would have been otherwise.
So tell me, let's talk a little bit about your mother and your mother's work. So she was a nurse, and when uh, did she work in Stanley? Did she work in the Ketchum-Haley area?
Um, she worked at the Sun Valley Hospital, and it was, I can correct the historical record here. It eventually became the Moritz Hospital, and it was named after Dr. Moritz, who was sort of the primary physician there for many, many years. And since that time, people have uh, transferred the pronunciation to San Moritz. So they pronounce it Moritz, which is wrong, and they shouldn't do that. Um,
So when were
but
you, did you move into Sun Valley for the winter time? Is that, and then is
well,
that,
you, you ask about her job. She was a registered nurse there. She took on uh, a lot of uh, overtime when she could. She was a super hard worker, and uh, a lot of times she would take on special duties. And one of the special duties was somebody would come to Sun Valley and break their leg, and then they'd have to go home. And she would take the train back to wherever they were from with the patient. And it was that was kind of an adventure for her. And um, the rumor in our family was that she had a number of marriage proposals from these patients, um, and she would reply that she was already married, and that was usually the end of it. But she was a good nurse and had a tremendous um, empathic skills, and I think she made people. One of her great talents was to make people comfortable around her. I think she probably made the bulk of our income. Well, I don't know that for sure, um, because both my parents were doing everything they could to pay off the $75 a month we owed on this place. And so, but we wouldn't have made it without her contribution. And she, of course, was fixing breakfast for all my father's clients at 4 a.m. in the morning, and running a household as well. And it was, I'm probably jumping ahead to one of your questions, but it was a great place for a little kid to grow up. And we got here when I was 3 years old. And um, I just remember sort of walking out and, as wandering around this new place. And um, one of my earliest memories is sort of sitting in the gravel of our front yard, and I don't know what I was doing, but my father came out and said, "Well, what are you doing, John?" And I said, "Well, I'm playing in the dirt," and it's kind of what I've been doing ever since. But it was, there. You ask, what did I do when there wasn't television? There was so much to do. If you're a curious little kid, and they had um, quite a lot of trouble keeping me from going out to the river during high water or going across the road. Um, and it wasn't a dangerous place to live, but there were dangers that if you got too close to, uh, you could die, and that was that was emphasized to me over and over and over again. And I learned those lessons very well until I got to be an adolescent, and then I didn't care about death anymore and courted it. But we made it through adolescence too. So, but this has been the center of my life since I was 3 years old, and um, it's one of the difficulties of growing old is you have to leave everything behind, and you know, I'm not sure if we can speculate about the afterlife, but I will speculate that I'll be very homesick when I get there, if there is one.
So tell me about your experiences with the Stanley School. What was school like?
Um, well, it was in the Quonset hut that's still there across from the bed and breakfast in town. And there were 2 rooms um, and 8 grades, 4 in the bigger rooms on the east side of the building and 4 in the little room on the west side of the building. I was the only person in the first grade, and that was in the fall of 1957. And Maddie Hansen was the teacher. And I stayed there for 6 weeks. And Maddie had, as I remember, had kind of a handful with the older second, third, and fourth graders. And I was a quiet little kid. I didn't want to cause much trouble. And that was fine with Maddie. And she would give me coloring books, and I'd sit in the corner and color all day. And at the end of 6 weeks, it became apparent to my parents that I hadn't learned much. And so very quickly, it was arranged for me and my older brother to go out to Haley and live in my grandmother's house in Haley. And Mom started working at the Sun Valley Hospital. Dad started trapping, and my brother and I went to school in Ketchum. Because well, I'm getting that wrong. I'm sorry. We went to school in Ketchum that first year, and then I think Dad went back to the mine later that year, and we moved back into company housing. But I still went to school in Ketchum, and my brother and I would get on the bus, and in Triumph, and it was this really exciting experience, to get on a bus with a whole bunch of people, and I wasn't really used to a lot of people because we lived over here, and so what I'm getting at here is that the economy, as soon as trapping ended, completely ended here. There was no economic activity to speak of in Stanley in the winter. And so you had to move elsewhere. And I think by that time, we were doing a little bit better financially, and we ended up buying another house in Haley for our winter home.
How long was your dad back at the mine?
He just spent that one winter there at the mine, and as soon as he could, he um, he had taught himself welding at the mine, and he became pretty good at it. And then it turned out that he could make a living as a welder, and um, I think I'm trying to get this all. I should have written a timeline for our family, but I think the next year we spent the winter in about 5 places as he went through construction jobs and welding jobs and pipeline jobs. And I know we moved from a couple of places in Boise to Buell, to Haley, and then I think maybe back to Boise. Um, and all with a little kid's perspective. And I don't remember. Once again, I don't remember thinking we were poor, but we must have been poor um, as those jobs kind of came and went all that winter. But it was by the next winter we bought the house in Haley, and then my mother had a steady job whenever she wanted it at the Sun Valley Hospital, and my father started driving ski bus in the winter. So uh, he would drive ski bus during ski season, trap spring and fall, and guide salmon during the summers until the salmon went away. And that was probably for him when he stopped being able to guarantee that salmon on the line for people. And I think around 1964 or 65, the runs began to falter pretty badly.
So, what do you remember about your time in company housing at Triumph Mine? I'm interested in what that experience was like to live in.
Well, it was uh, a nice uh, for a little kid. It was a secure, safe place. Um, my parents were um, working hard, but generally having a pretty good time, as I remember. They loved each other, and there was a lot of humor and a lot of uh, sort of, I wouldn't call it joking around, but I remember my father would make up poems all the time, and that was kind of one of the things he did, And I didn't become a poet, but I did become a wordsmith of sorts. So I remember we were a family in love with words, I think. And I remember it being, it was a mining town, and there were places that little kids could wander around. But I remember getting caught by the night watchman up by the mine, up by the tunnels, with Mike Gott, who lived next door. And we were probably 6 and 5 at that time. And we'd climbed up these series of stair steps to get up to the mine. And when the night watchman caught us, he grabbed us and took us home. And and everything was okay. It was no big deal. And I don't think that um, the lead and silver ore was in a form that was too bioavailable, or I probably wouldn't have gone to college. But my God, I remember he he had a habit of eating dirt, and which is one of the symptoms of lead poisoning. Um, so I don't know what um, the I don't know what bad effects we had from living there. There was no smelter there, so we didn't breathe a lot of lead in, but there was a processing plant, a mill, and so there was probably a lot of free lead dust coating everything. Uh, so I lived there the first 3 years of my life, and then 1 year when I between 6 and 7. Um, so uh, probably any more time there, and I would have had a much different career than a college professor.
So tell me about some of the characters that you ran across when you were living in Stanley. Who were some of the local personalities that sort of defined the area when you were a child?
Well, we knew everybody uh, who lived on ranches in the valley, and so um, above our place, which was kind of the northernmost place in the valley, uh, there was Harry Fleming, and then Bill Sullivan's place. Um, Stub Merritt and Vela Merritt, and Vela was Dave Lee's um, mother, and uh, and that's the David O. Lee that the peak is named after. Above that was Ted and Phyllis Williams, and I forget the next one. Um, on up the valley was on the other side of the road was Morgan Williams, and then the Shaw Ranch. And when I knew them, that was run by Margie Shaw, and it was um, it was a place we visited quite a bit because my mother's sister had married Alden Shaw, who also lived up there, and but she had died in the first year of their marriage, and so that was a place um, that they uh, kind of returned to. Uh, and I remember when I was a really little kid staying there in a tent frame. And all I remember about that was just feeling really comfortable because the sleeping bags we were sleeping in were really warm. Uh, but that was the Shaw place. On up was um, Obsidian, not where Obsidian is now, but it had a post office in the south end of the valley. And Trigger Jim and his wife, Verna, lived there. Uh, Trigger Jim was a gunsmith. He had been severely wounded in the war and had a plate in his head. But he was a good gunsmith. Um, Beyond that, my knowledge didn't go very far. When we went the other way, we went to town. There was Merle Wells, who had the gas station out by the T. At that point, it was a Y. Um, and let's see, there was no Mountain Village buildings there whatsoever. Ray Achenbaugh had a little tar paper shack out there where the Mountain Village stands now, the motel. And Preston Shaw ran the Rock Garage. He was a member of the Shaw family. Bill Wall, the Wall Street is named after, lived on Wall Street. The Critchfields, Bud and Stella, lived on down to where the bed and breakfast is today. I don't remember who owned the hotel before the Coles, but when I was a kid, they were the ones that owned it. It was before the Coles bought it.
That's the Sawtooth Hotel.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the old Stanley Club, which was a pretty elaborate log building, was where, there was the post office. Gregory's store was in next to that. C.A. Gregory, whose name is on a lot of photographs of the locals. And then the Stanley Club. And the people I really wanted to talk about, because you'd get references to them in some of the other recordings you've made. And it was Russell and Susie Vaughn. And they were a big part of the town, because Susie was also a registered nurse, although she wouldn't let anybody know that. She didn't want to be the medical person in the valley. And she was quite brusque, and her language was pretty violent. I remember her telling me as a 5 or 6 year old that she was going to cut Russ up with his butcher knife and make him into hamburger. And they had a little restaurant there in that little cabin that is right across from the library now. And that was also the liquor store. Russ and Susie had come into this country from Chicago in the probably late 30s. I don't know the dates, and that would be their life story really needs to be researched, and I have no idea how you could do that. But they came to Chicago, or from Chicago, and ended up caretaking the Greyhound mine for the winter, for 2 winters at least. And the Greyhound mine is about as far as you could get from any place in Idaho, and Idaho was pretty far from any place at that time too. And Russ knew an awful lot about crime in Chicago, and it has always crossed my mind that they were looking to hide out when they got in this valley. And they wouldn't be the first people to do that. We have a tradition of people who dodged the draft in World War II, which was not an honorable thing to do. But there were people who had little cabins up in the Sawtooths, and they stayed there through the war. And Russ may have been, he wasn't dodging the draft, but he might have been dodging the mob. He had been an undertaker in Chicago, and I suppose the mob had use for an undertaker now and then. Russ and Susie, Russ told me one time, and the way he put it was we showed up in our Klan robes at Halloween parties, and they were real Klan robes, and most of the people hadn't gone to all that trouble to get costumes. So he said we made quite a stir, and we decided not to do that anymore. And it was, you got the feeling that they had come to Stanley not entirely willingly, but with the idea that they were going to start a new start. And Russ began working on log cabins around the place. He had a beautiful log house in town that burned down, and that burned down after my parents had inherited it. One of their renters burned it down one spring. Russ and Susie had good educations, and they lived a very low-key life. But Russ was in spite of being a Klan member, he was this gentle old guy who became a really good friend of our families. Susie, once my mother got in the valley, Susie sort of became her helper if there were any medical issues, because there was no clinic in those days, and no doctors, nobody to take care of people who got hurt. And you had to get them out, dead or alive, and a lot of them were dead. I remember there was a guy under a blanket in our driveway one morning because this woman drove up in her car and knocked on the door, and my mother opened it, and she said, "I think my husband's dead," and he was dead of a heart attack in the car. And so, I think Mom, I think possibly she delivered one baby, but her advice to very pregnant women was to get to a hospital or near a hospital for the next month or so. And it doesn't matter if your husband wants to go fishing.
So people would show up at your house because your mother was a nurse, but
Yeah.
she didn't have any agreement with anyone in
Oh,
town that she
no.
was going to be the medical provider.
Everything was informal. And I mean, to give you an example of how that worked, we got, I think, a 50% discount on our phone bill if we agreed to let the public use our phone. So there was a public phone sign on our gate, and people would stop in and use the phone, and away they would go. And that worked out well. If you were a fishing guide, you could say, yeah, you can use the phone, and oh, by the way, I'm guiding a party of fishermen tomorrow, and you want to join it. So that sort of thing was a very different. We had very different ideas about community and privacy, what uh, whatever we could do to be a part of the community, we did. And it wasn't a matter of wanting to be a part of the community. It was just, you're here, you're part of the community, and you damn well better live up to your responsibilities. But that was such a different era, and our ideas about self-sufficiency are so off the mark now, because self-sufficiency for a lot of people is a camo suit, a rifle, and a pickup and a trailer, and that doesn't work. It doesn't work economically because you don't have to spend all that money. You can go to Costco in the meat department and you get better meat, and it's way less expensive. So, but that sort of thing was, I mean, in my education, I've learned things about settler imperialism and what horrible things were done to the people that were living here when white people got here. At the time, we didn't know that, and we were in a place that took a lot of community to survive in, and a lot of hard work to survive in. And so the ethics that came out of that were the type of ethics that, say, Russ and Susie Vaughn could put their past aside and become pillars of the community, as it were. And everything that we did with people was sort of present oriented. Didn't matter. The past didn't matter nearly as much as it does now. So that's not to say that people didn't hold grudges and feuds didn't go on for years and years and years, but there was a sense, I think, of, you went to Stanley for a new start, and if you're tough enough, you could make it. And most people didn't. That's another thing I wanted to mention was, the number of young couples who come to Stanley and look at the mountains and look how beautiful it is and say, we want to spend our lives here. What do we have to do it? And they're here on a rotating basis. They don't make it. And it's kind of hard, as somebody whose family did make it, to watch those people rotate through. But it's now the valley is gentrified.
Yeah.
And
Well,
you and I are part of that.
Yes, we are. Well, and hard to see people rotate through because it's a different type of community, right? It's not the community that it was.
Yeah. And I would say that one of the questions you asked was, what are the break points? When did things start changing? And that's a really complicated question, because Bill Harrah came in to the valley during the 50s, I believe, and bought up a lot of property and prevented gentrification, simply because he sat on all that property and it wasn't developed. And And then after he died on the operating table of a heart operation when I think he was 69 at the time. So pretty young man by my standards these days. And
Too.
he, his heirs got in a battle, as you might expect. And so all of those properties became part of Stan Hera Corporation, which was Stanley Hera and his property there. And the joke around town, and this may be cruel and it may be wrong, but the joke was that Stanley served as the place where bad people in Reno got sent when they needed to be exiled from the corporate center. But that lasted for a really long time. And the next thing that really changed the valley was when Tim and Becky took over the bakery, and you could drive up from Ketchum and have lunch and look around and see if there was any place for sale, you know. And the bakery made a huge difference. And then they did the same thing with the Sawtooth Hotel, and they worked really hard, and they've made a really successful business there. But they did, by just showing how it was done, they did change the whole town. And that now we're looking at. The problem with capitalism is that it becomes late capitalism, and late capitalism has these huge pools of money that aren't doing anything, and so people buy up property and go away for all but 2 weeks in the year. So it destroys communities. It destroys the ability of young people to come here, make a living, buy a house. It just doesn't work anymore. So a little ideological point there.
John, do you think that the accessibility of places like the bakery or the Sawtooth Hotel, those kind of things that allowed people to come to drop in and see the place, was more impactful than having the designation of a national recreation area, as far as having things like uh, you know hiking and boating and things that were available, fishing? Um,
I I have a much different take on that. When the Sawtooth National Recreation Area saved this valley from um, being subdivided, and I may be contradicting myself here, but there were quarter-acre lots in the Upper Valley, and I remember I was working for the Forest Service when the SNRA came in, and there were some. I believe I saw some records that said the Forest Service had bought up 1,100 properties south of the Alturas Lake Creek Bridge, the county line. So in Blaine County alone, they had bought up 1,100 lots and quite a few houses on those lots, but not anywhere near 1,100. And people were furious because they had bought these lots because this was going to be their retirement home, and it was going to be in this beautiful valley in Idaho. And all of the meadow between the road and Pettit Lake, where the hills start to go up, all of that meadow was subdivided. All of the Obsidian subdivision was there. Subdivisions down by the river next to the bridge just before Redfish from the Upper Valley. All of those things were bought out, and it was under 20 acres. Right across our fence here, there was a little place on a half-acre lot. It had two houses there, and they were forced out by condemnation. And people don't forgive those sorts of things, you know. So the other side of that is that you can imagine, say, another 2,000 houses in the valley if the SNRA hadn't come in, and that's 2,000 houses worth of sewage. And you can imagine what the Salmon River would be like. We live in a sort of a Pleistocene environment up here, and it doesn't, you know, things don't grow very much. And so like you have in certain parts of Alaska that I've been, you have a garbage problem. You have a waste problem, and so, you know, on balance, I'm very glad that the SNRA came in and put a stop to development in the valley. And now it's very indicative that they have a lower limit on the size of houses in this valley, because everybody was bringing little bread loaf trailers up here and parking them on their lots. And nobody had any idea that we would have 13,000 square foot houses in this valley. Why would anybody build something that big in the first place? My friend Bruce Coburn says there must be giants in those houses. You know, and I have a little more reasonable explanation, is that they've all got body image disorders. But it's one of those things that you can look at and say things have changed so much economically in the country that something that the Forest Service didn't even think about has become the chief characteristic of this valley.
Sure,
And
sure.
you know, we've got a problem, just like Sun Valley has a problem. We've got all these empty houses and a housing crisis. And, you know, usually those things take care of themselves if you read history, but it takes a few decades, and it's not a pleasant process. But that's looking at the future, and I think Sawtooth Valley is going to have other problems than just class warfare.
Well, let's refocus on. We can probably spend hours and hours on class warfare, since it
Well,
is.
it causes a refocus quite often.
Yeah, let's do it. So let's talk about when you first moved away from Stanley, and how you integrated into life outside of here. When you stopped coming for the summers, when was that?
When I went to college, and my orbits were pretty much Stanley in the summer, or Sawtooth Valley in the summer. I worked for the Forest Service as a wilderness ranger once I got to be 18, and then I worked for Sun Valley on the Sun Valley Ski Patrol, starting when I was 17 in high school. And I'd just gone back and forth, and then went to college, and that was a shock because I went to the College of Idaho and learned how to write. And then after a year at the College of Idaho, I became convinced that there was a lot going on in the world and I wanted to be where it was happening, and it wasn't Caldwell. And so I managed to transfer to Harvard, which was not an easy thing to do then and now, I'm sure. But it was that was a real shock. First time I'd ever been out of Idaho on a plane. I'd flown a lot of helicopters when I was fighting fire, but that was my first year as a wilderness ranger, and they used to let us fight fire to make a little bit of money toward the end of the year every year. But anyway, got on a plane, got off at Logan Airport after changing through Chicago, and it was really a frightening experience. But I was, young and pretty stupid and didn't know how scary that world was. Didn't know enough to be scared. But I
Did
did.
you know anyone else there?
No, I knew no one. And in fact, transfer students didn't get a orientation week. We just got thrown into it, and I had a really tough first year. Very homesick. I just remember calling up my relatives on Thanksgiving where my parents were and hearing laughter and turkey baking in the background. I didn't know you could hear it, but you can if you're homesick enough. And it was exquisite pain of homesickness, and I was thinking about quitting school and joining the Army, which was not a wise thing to do in 1969. And but I remember sort of having a little talk with myself saying, you got yourself into this, you're going to get yourself out of it. And I was in pretty bad academic trouble that spring, and that was spring of 1970. And then May 4th, 1970 was Kent State, and they canceled all classes, gave us all passes, saved my ass. And I came home and started working for the Forest Service again, and then was able to go back 2 more years, kind of get my act together, which it needed badly, and I graduated. But getting drafted was an incentive to stay in school, and I stayed. By then, we were hearing stories from people who had come home from Vietnam, and their advice was pretty much universally, don't go if you can avoid it. Anyway, I did pretty well the last couple of years at Harvard because I learned how to work the catalog and take classes that involved a lot of writing and a lot of reading, and I was good at those. And that's kind of how I ended up being a writer. It was, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it was the easiest way out. And that's only because I didn't know how hard it was going to be.
So when you started your writing career, when you were in college, were you thinking that you would be an author, that you would be a professor? I know you are both or have been both. But what were you thinking would happen once you graduated?
Um, I didn't know. I didn't have any idea. I didn't have a plan. And um, I had an uncle who was a pathologist, and he suggested that I go to med school, but it was that was I was my parents' kid, and going to med school would have involved borrowing enormous amounts of money, and that was just not an option for me constitutionally. So um, that that was out. Um, and at that time, I had this wilderness ranger job in the summers, a ski patrol job in the winters. Um, Neither one of them paid very much, but I didn't need very much. In the spring and the fall, there was unemployment. And I don't know how long that would have lasted, except that um, a, a little private school started up in Ketchum, and somehow the headmaster heard that I'd gone to Harvard, and he corralled me on the mountain one day and said, you know, you think you could teach English? We need an English teacher. And so I fell into that job, and it turned out to be a doorway into a much bigger world. And I ended up back at the College of Idaho as a professor eventually. It was,
So
oh, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna ask, when you came back from college, you were doing Forest Service in the season and ski patrol in the season. Were you still coming up to Stanley? Did you still have the same connection? Your parents were still in Stanley, correct?
Well, Russell Vaughn, when he died, um, willed that little cabin across from the library to me. And so I was living from the time I was 17 years old, I was living in that cabin in the summers. Um, and uh, I Russell Vaughn helped me um, sort of plumb the cabin and put in gas and electric where it was failing, and it was he when I first went to live in it, he was still alive, and he charged me $30 a month for rent. So, and it was worth every penny. So, but I described that in my book Traplines, that those Stanley years, and I guess I've written a lot of personal history over the years. So, if this interview sparks any curiosity, the books are out there if you want them. In any event, um, yeah, Stanley. I've spent since 1953. I've spent parts of every year here, and then since 2004, Julie and I have lived here year round. So, um, in terms of seniority, I suppose I've got as much as anybody else in the valley, maybe more, but it's not a contest.
Yeah, yeah. So it, I guess just to questions about writing and writing in Stanley and does that type of isolation help your creative process? Um, does it, uh, do you mostly write about your experiences in Stanley, or does it help to inform your worldview on your other writing themes?
Well, I've thought about that quite a bit because I've just published a 3-volume journal of the plague years, and it's sort of looking at the process because Julie and I sort of decided to publish a blog, and you have to look over everything and do your best to edit. And fortunately, Julie's a wonderful editor. But what I think I did as a writer is started looking at Sawtooth Valley as this microcosm, and it is. If you look at Google Earth, Sawtooth Valley doesn't look very big, and it's also one of those places that has walls around it, and so you can look at it as a discrete place, but it's a very small discrete place. And then you go out at night and you look up and the air is clear and the Milky Way is stretching 250,000 light years in all directions. And so as a writer, I noticed I wasn't doing this consciously, but I was doing it. I switched back and forth between the microcosm and the macrocosm. And then humans are sort of this awkward size in the middle, where you don't, you've got a telescope in one room and a microscope in the other, and you have to live in between the two. And it's, Newtonian physics has some limitations, especially where our imagination is concerned. So it's been this wonderful position where you can go from the very small to the very big and back and forth. And I notice I've done that a lot in the essays that I've written, especially over the last 20 years. So I do think that the place has a huge effect. I couldn't have written anything at all like it if it hadn't been here. On the other hand, I ended up as a travel writer after I taught for a while. I taught writing, and I finally figured out that I'd better be able to write if I'm going to teach it. And so I ended up as a travel writer and went all over the world for the ski magazines and for Travel and Leisure. And when you work for magazines, you're working with highly professional editors and people who really don't want to talk about anything except your article on the phone. They don't want to hear about your day, and they don't want to tell you about their day. But that experience made me realize that, to be a writer, you have to have deadlines. And if you have deadlines, you can write any place. You can write in a motel room, you can write on the beach. And so that aspect of it means you can probably write any place. And I can go to someplace else and write an essay for my blog, and did it quite a lot. I mean, I wrote in guest houses in Thailand when I was writing a newspaper column, and just made sure I got the deadline and sent it in, and everything was going. But I did take where I learned to write with me, and so there's sort of the structure of that microcosm macrocosm through that goes through all my writing, and it's I've finally gotten old enough to set my own deadlines, but it takes a certain amount of maturity, and unfortunately, about the time you get that maturity, your talents fail, and so.
So John, let's I think to sort of wrap up our discussion, tell me how you feel your beloved Stanley has changed over the years. How is more and more people are coming into the valley. It's busier. I'm sure the sense of community is different. Tell me what you think.
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because I just finished Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And in that book, she says, God is change, and that is certainly true in Sawtooth Valley. I don't see much point in fighting it, because it's a Bambi versus Godzilla proposition. I do mourn some of the things that are no longer here, and I don't like all the big houses and buildings that are going up in the valley. But that's what's going to happen to beautiful places in the West. And I'm taking a look at the larger impact of climate change in the world, and the Pacific Northwest is one of the few places on Earth that isn't getting kind of climatically dangerous to live. And so I think we're going to have a lot of refugees, and there will be a little subtle flip from tourist to refugee, and it'll probably happen without us noticing it too much. But as soon as it does happen, all of a sudden we'll notice that the people who are coming through the valley aren't going home. And I think it's going to be a tough time, and it's going to make us look maybe hard-hearted to the people that want to move in here. But there are people in the valley that are planning on closing the roads in there. So you need to get out of Boise and into Casino Creek before that
I'm on my way.
yeah. So there's no fighting it, but there are big forces going on in the world right now, and it'll make individual human effort look pretty futile. And I don't think we're in control of our own destiny anymore as a country, or even as a community. So that's not the cheeriest answer, but that's my answer.
I think it is hard from a global perspective to be cheery right now. So I think that it's realistic. And we'll edit it somehow so that it doesn't end on the down note. So.
Okay. Well, I'll show you my last volume. That's called Aftermath, and it's about living in the ruins and living well in the ruins if possible. So if that's an up note,
Yeah.
So be it.
Yeah. That's the volume I'm gonna go look at.
Okay, good.
So, John, is there anything else that that you wanted to make sure that we talked about, or that you anything else that you can think of? I think I asked most of the questions.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, the one thing I've noticed in myself recently is that I used to say that Stanley was an anti-community. And basically, people moved there because they wanted to be left alone and didn't want to be social. And I think it's been a real education for me to come up here living with Julie and watch how she builds community um, and I'm changing my attitude on communitarians. I think building a community is going to be a survival skill from here on out. It's been that way for some time, but uh, the anti-communitarians are probably not going to do very well in the next 10 and 20 years. So you can put me down as a communitarian. I'll try to do my part. I know Julie will. So anyway, that's that would be my final comment.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, John, I really thank you. I appreciate your time, and I think the next steps forward from here, and maybe I'll stop the recording.
Okay.